of my sets video. If you want to check out part 1, which is all about the coverage of every set, then you can find the link in the description below. So as I said in the previous video, this video is going to be all about general test taking tips, reviewing tips, and I will also touch on review centers, their disadvantages and advantages, and lastly, on the day itself reminders. So again, I'm gonna put a quick disclaimer out here before I get started. Everything I'm about to say in this video will be based on my own experiences and opinions, so what works for me may not work for you, so please be discerning in digesting everything I'm about to say. So now let's get started with the general test taking tips. So first is in math. My first tip for the math section of the college entrance test is to not spend too much time on a certain question. So do remember that no matter the level of difficulty a question is, everything is just worth a point. Be discerning when it comes to answering or choosing to answer certain items or test questions that will take a very long time to solve. So my next tip is don't memorize too many formulas. From what I've experienced, not a lot of those very lengthy formulas will be used. Just be familiar with your different theorems, the basic theorems, postulates in geom and trig. For instance, your Pythagorean theorem, that's a classic and that's an essential. Know your angles, your quadrants, sine, cosine, tangent, and also practice a lot when it comes to algebra and general arithmetic. So remember that when practicing for the math subtests, don't just focus on the accuracy of your answers, but also on the time and the speed it takes for you to answer them, because usually for the math sections of the admission tests, your number one enemy is time. And my third tip for the math section is do know when it's easier or it's faster to simply use the process of elimination in answering certain items or questions, because sometimes it's faster to just plug in the different choices for X rather than to use the formula. So there you go. Those are my tips for the math section. Next, for your language proficiency section, I just have 2 tips. First is use context clues when it comes to perhaps determining synonyms, antonyms, word definitions, vocabulary questions, and the like. And aside from that, also be knowledgeable and familiar with your different prefixes and suffixes. Okay, so now for the reading comprehension section. So usually for reading comprehension, it would be really time consuming unless you know how to proceed. So my tip number 1 would be to read the questions first before reading the passage itself. So majority of my entrance tests, what I did was to read the questions and then skim and scan through the passage to be able to answer those questions. So tip number 2 is, like I said, practice skimming and scanning through long passages of text, and practice your ability to quickly determine the main idea and theme of a passage through skimming and scanning, because as I remember, a lot of the reading comprehension questions were about what's the main idea or what's the theme of this certain passage. Now my tips for science. So my first tip for science would be to familiarize yourself with basic concepts in earth science, biology, including genetics, please don't forget genetics, chemistry, including stoichiometry, and physics. So as I said, just familiarize yourself. You don't have to memorize the smallest of details, especially in biology. I think you'd be wasting your time if you memorize everything. And my tip number 2 would be to practice analyzing samples of scientific scenarios and diagrams, because a lot of these will appear in your sets. Okay, so now that we're done with the general test taking tips, here are some tips I'd like to give you when it comes to reviewing for your sets. My first tip would be, and I know you've heard this before, but I can't stress enough the importance of this tip, and that is to know yourself. This tip is very important because it helps you learn more effectively and more efficiently, and it also helps you to avoid ineffective ways of learning. So certain questions you could ask yourself to be able to know yourself better when it comes to studying are: what's my learning style? Am I an auditory learner, a visual learner, and the like? And once you've determined what kind of a learner you are, then you can proceed with asking yourself, what study techniques will work for me, or what study techniques have worked for me before. I know of some people who sing to be able to memorize stuff, who use abbreviations, people who write down their notes, again, rewrite their notes. And as for myself, I figured out that one of the techniques that helped me really absorb and memorize information is by explaining these things aloud as if I'm teaching them to a class or to someone. Another question you could ask yourself is, what are the topics that are familiar or unfamiliar to me? Because then you'll be able to prioritize the things that you are still unfamiliar with. And another question similar to the previous one is, what are my strong and weak points? So maybe you're not that good at math, so if that's the case, then practice more on math. Maybe you're not that good at science, so that's where you spend more of your time on. Another question you can ask yourself, aside from the ones I've mentioned, is, do I study better on my own or in groups? So those are just a few of the questions you can use to be able to evaluate yourself. Remember that it's important to study hard, but it's also important to study smart. So my next tip would be to take online tests and simulations of the college entrance test. Especially for the day before the test itself, for me it's better to just take mock exams rather than try to memorize more information or review the lessons again. So a lot of resources can be found online. A lot of sites offer free tests and simulations that are catered accordingly to every admission test. So just search it up and a lot of resources will be made available for you. Now you can also buy reviewers and booklets for the sets. So I got these ones. And I just bought these from National Bookstore. But you certainly can do without them, and I feel like they're not that worth it because, as I said, there's a lot of resources available for you online. So my third tip for you would be to create a study checklist or agenda of all the topics that you'd want to review for the college entrance tests. So this agenda should be made up of most of the lessons that you've had in high school, particularly in your math, science, and English subject. I think having a study agenda is very helpful when it comes to being more systematic in your reviewing, and it also helps make you feel more confident knowing that you've covered a lot of topics during your review session. Okay, so tip number 4 is related to tip number 3. So my tip number 4 would be to set a scheduled time and place for your review sessions. So in doing this, keep in mind that it's best to have regular review sessions, meaning you can do it on a daily or every other day basis. And aside from that, just allocate a short amount of time for every review session. So at least an hour, and at most maybe 2 hours for every session, because it's important to take breaks every now and then. And when you review for such a long time, your tendency is you'd get burnt out and you'd have a harder time absorbing and memorizing information. Don't be super strict with it too. You don't have to stress yourself out whenever you miss a study session. So just make up for it in your next one. Aside from those, also find an environment that is conducive for studying. So again, this is based on your evaluation of yourself. So it depends on where you are the most productive. So for some it could be at home. For some it could be at a coffee shop or with a group of friends. And then during your study sessions, be sure to take a break every now and then. What I do is I'd study for about 30 minutes and then I'd go on my phone or sleep after that. Tip number 5 would be to pray. So during set season, for me, it's really important to saturate myself with God's word and His promises and to be in constant communication with Him. It also helps for me to build God confidence in me so that I will take the tests knowing that God is fully in control and that I've done my part and God will do the rest. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the whole reviewing process is review centers. So a lot of you are probably contemplating whether or not you should enroll in a review center because it's quite pricey. So I'm going to list down advantages and disadvantages of doing so you'd be able to decide for yourself. But if you'd ask me, I did enroll in a review center in Expert Guides, and based on my own experiences, I found it to be very helpful in preparing me for the sets. So let's talk about the advantages. So the number one advantage of enrolling in a review center is that they have a comprehensive curriculum. So technically they synthesize all your high school lessons for you, and that's the curriculum that you're going to be following for all of your review sessions. And aside from your high school lessons, they also provide helpful techniques in test taking and educated guessing. The number 2 advantage of enrolling in a review center is that they have course materials and modules that they will provide for you. We were given 2 modules, so we were given a math and then a sciences and languages module, and if you can see, they're pretty bulky and thick because that's 4 years worth of high school lessons packed there. So review centers each offer their own version of test reviewers, and what's good is that these modules and even the test simulations in it are actually patterned after the college entrance test. So meaning that these materials take into consideration the subjects, topics, question forms that may appear on your sets. So these reviewers are pretty reliable. But I would say that things that we discussed here and the simulations here are actually harder than those in the actual admission test. Third advantage is aligned to what I said earlier. Review centers give you simulation tests and mock exams that will give you a feel of what it is like to take your entrance test. So the fourth advantage is that review centers have a classroom type setting. However, if you look at it, this can be a disadvantage for some people. It depends really on your learning style, but some people can learn and comprehend information better when they are in a classroom type setting, when they are surrounded by a larger group of people and are taught by experienced professors who have coached students before and who know what they're doing. And the last advantage of enrolling in a review center is that you have a scheduled and structured time and agenda for reviewing, which helps you develop the discipline to review. Now let's move on to the cons or the disadvantages of enrolling in a review center. So the first and I think most obvious disadvantage of enrolling in a review center is that they're very expensive, and for the price that you pay, you still cannot be guaranteed to pass the admission tests, and you can definitely learn on your own for free. So the second disadvantage of enrolling in a review center is the non-flexible schedule. So your absence for a session is not redeemable, so whatever lesson or topic that you've missed, you can't get that back, and you can't choose the most convenient time for you to review. The third disadvantage of enrolling in a review center is that every review session is very tightly packed and crammed. So this is because the teachers have to essentially cram 4 years worth of high school lessons into a very limited time frame. So you could expect that every review session will be very information heavy, and you'd really be struggling to digest all the information thrown at you by the professors. Review centers will really not teach you everything you have to know. More or less, they're just going to refresh your memory and teach you test-taking techniques and strategies that you could use. But if you ask me, I'd still think that the money spent on a review center was worth it. So now that we're done with my tips for the whole reviewing process, let's talk about the things that you should remember on the day of the test. First tip is go to the testing site early. So do expect very heavy traffic on the day of the exams themselves, and it's better to be very early than late. Next is don't forget all your important materials and documents, especially your test permits, your IDs, your pencil, your eraser, your snacks, and other documents required by the school that you have to bring. Next is dress for success, meaning dress well and dress comfortably. So dress in something that makes you feel confident but at the same time makes you feel comfortable. So it's important to bring a jacket because you never know when you're going to be placed in an air-conditioned room, and also wear a watch because since you won't have access to your mobile phones, your only way of telling the time is through your watch. The next tip would be to double check your answers if you still have time. Please don't be complacent and do your best really in taking these exams because these are once in a lifetime experiences and they will alter the course of your life forever. So my next tip would be to make it a habit to check if you're answering the right number. So once in a while, check if the number you're answering in the questionnaire is the same as the number you're shading in the answer sheet, because if you just miss one number and adjust everything that could make such a huge difference in your score. And lastly is learn from every college entrance test. So if there are certain topics or questions that you found difficult in a certain test, try to remember those so that you can study them further when you get home, because you never know, they might also appear on the next college entrance test that you're going to be taking. That's going to be it for this video. Hopefully I was able to give you helpful tips and advice when it comes to taking your college entrance tests. I really wish that God will bless you and all your endeavors, and I know you can do it. Just believe in yourself. Please comment, like, and subscribe to our channel for more content. Bye!